through the concept of less about the techie part of it, which is sort of where Scott and I tend to go in our brains, and more toward the regulatory governance part of it, and to get some specific feedback on that. So 10 minutes would be fair to frame the issue at the most?
Yeah.
And then I have some questions. Lee has already bugged me about some questions as well, so I will, if you see me scrolling, I'm answering an email. I'm actually getting emails and passing on some questions. But I'll pass it on, and don't forget there is a live stream going for those of you who aren't familiar with how this works.
Great, thank you. Great, well thank you all so much for being here. I'm really looking forward to your feedback on what is sort of just an early conceptual mapping at this point. So really any level of feedback and sort of questions that will help me sort of push this project forward will be greatly appreciated. So thank you in advance. So I'm going to just sort of do a quick overview of how I see parts 1 and 2, kind of working to do some conceptual work of setting up what I hope to be sort of a conversation on what other knowledge traditions I need to be looking at that can do good conceptual work for sort of the type of marketplace and marketplace interaction that I set up in the first 2 parts of this paper. So just gonna run through a quick overview and then we can jump right into it. So in part 1, I set up what I hope to do in greater detail is sort of setting up a general overview of the data marketplace, which I argue has a few key characteristics. One is a relationship between technology companies that sort of combines a concentration of market power and a concentration of data and informational power. And this sort of arises for a number of reasons. One being that they're operating, sort of the early movers in this space were operating in winner-take-all markets and exerting the power of network effects that reinforce the value of insights gained by big data analytics. That market power is then both created and maintained by a further prioritization of data collection. So you see that in platform companies that have predominantly revenue from advertising, where we are both the product in terms of our attention and the means to the product, which is to say a means to gain analytical insights that allow Facebook or Google to sell micro-targeted advertising services. You also see this sort of relationship of market power created and maintained by data collection in non-advertising. So you see this in the emergence of sharing economy companies where we are not actually the product in terms of advertising or attention, but we are means to the product. So for example, Uber doesn't sell our attention, but it does track our behavior to make fine-grained predictions about how long we will wait, how much we will pay, and whether we will come back for a ride. So this sort of analytically driven market power is concentrated by technology companies. So they use data and information collection as an asset to gain market power and dominate their winner-take-all markets, where the network effect will eventually win out. And they sort of pioneered these successful business models on the basis of treating information as an asset, as a key business asset, and viewing information collection as value creation for their company. This, I also argue, is sort of increasingly being adopted by companies that we would not traditionally think of as technology companies in the business of data collection. So you sort of see the rise of certain types of strategic acquisitions and sort of business development by companies like CVS or major insurers that are buying up data brokers or sort of increasingly partnering with data brokers to do what I sort of call a datafication of the economy. And here I draw comparisons from sociologist Greta Krippner's work where she talks about the financialization of the economy, where you saw the outsized impact of big banks, not just in overall GDP growth, but also then the financial model of value creation being adopted by traditionally non-finance companies like GM, whose auto credit sort of division of the business was at one point sort of the most dominant and most profitable aspect of that business. And so I argue that you sort of are seeing emerging early trends of a similar move happening with data collection as a key value generating venture for traditionally non-technology companies. So all of this structures a marketplace in which personal information has become a class of asset, and the harvesting and collection of this cheap, low-risk, yet valuable resource is what I call the data imperative. And I just want to pause here and say that the comparison to the financialization, I don't think is just a useful structural analog for what's happening on the business side. I think it also nicely captures how we should be thinking of governance approaches to something that isn't sector specific, but is more accurately defined almost as like a class of asset, and needs to be treated that way in our regulatory responses. So that's sort of part one. Part two is where I sort of am a lawyer and I turn to what's the legal regime governing this marketplace and structuring this marketplace. So generally, the law that governs the treatment of our personal information and imposes limits on the treatment of our personal information is privacy law. Current privacy law governs private sector data management only through particular sector-specific controls, and those controls predominantly affect how the data, once collected, should be processed and shared. So this is looking at requirements of anonymization. For example, HIPAA doesn't necessarily control what information can be collected. It does control whether that information is appropriately anonymized when it is processed or shared. So very few privacy law has to do with structural limitations on what can be collected at all. As a result, from a legal perspective, the scope of what can be collected and for what purposes is left largely to the two individual parties to determine via contract. In other words, the data marketplace is structured as one in which the only limit placed on the extraction of this asset is individual consent. These contracts are negotiated in one-to-one interactions between, at this point, predominantly technology companies with significant information advantages and significant network effects, and on the other hand, consumers. So I argue that these transactions are marked by a significant power imbalance, and that the informational advantage that companies already have exert even further and entrench that power imbalance. So this results in a few things. One, and this is an open empirical claim, but that surplus value is going in this transaction is going predominantly to the producer or the technology company. That we have an overharvesting of data as an asset or a resource because it is cheap and it is risk-free. And then sort of interrelatedly, most of the risk from the extraction of personal information is being transferred to the consumer and to the public. And so you sort of have a negative externality effect that's going on. In part three, as a sort of proposed response to this type of marketplace, I propose this idea of sort of reinvigorating this idea of a reasonable consumer as a limit around what we can contract around and where liability or harm is distributed in this transaction. So this idea of a reasonable consumer limit is grounded in legal approaches to other contracts formed in the shadow of unequal power, namely sort of traditional business-consumer contract relationships. And it's sort of grounded in an empirical claim about how people actually can transact regarding their digital lives and how people actually make choices about data collection. Implicit in this is also a normative claim that to the extent law is enforced to achieve socially beneficial outcomes, it should be built from some presumption or basic prediction based on how people actually make choices and actually transact. So as a quick definition of the reasonable consumer of data, what I say is when entering into a transaction for data collection, the reasonable consumer believes and expects that the transaction that they're entering into is reasonably safe, both for themselves and for others, and is reasonably for the thing or the service that they are engaging with, for themselves and for others. And a corollary to that is that it's not for some completely other hidden thing that they have no visibility into. If this definition is not met, then relying solely on the market solution, and in legal terms solely on the contract premised on consent, will fail to provide the mutually expected outcome for consumers and should be subject to the consumer or an agency enforcing a consumer right to bring claims for violating that legitimate consumer expectation. So I think what I would love to hear from the room is sort of in sum, this general data marketplace is sort of one structured by one-to-one interactions between consumers and companies with massive power imbalances that rely almost exclusively on individual contractual consent to govern the extraction and amassing of a valuable but also potentially dangerous resource. So I would be really interested in hearing useful analogs. We are in Ostrom, and so thinking about environmental analogs to collective management of valuable but also potentially dangerous resources would be really useful, or just sort of other frameworks. And I don't know, Angie, if you had other questions as well.
Let's see if that I do. I have a list, but I will open up the floor first to that comment on those type of suggestions of other frameworks or comments in general.
Sure.
And I have a list, but I'm bad at it. So just be aware, I'm bad at the list of whoever's turn it is. I'm bad at this. Great. Comment?
Hi, my name is Ricardo. I
Hello.
am a PhD student from the School of Public and Environmental Affairs.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it's helpful or not, but the definition that you provide of big data at the beginning as a technique, an alternative approach would be thinking of big data as a set of several approaches, right?
Right.
In which the idea is to analyze huge data sets, and these approaches are feasible because of a combination of different factors, right? So first is we have technological improvements for data collection, that's one, right? But we also have better computational capacity to handle that amount of information. So these are already two different factors. And then the third one, it might be or not that we need different analytical techniques, right? So machine learning is only one of several analytical techniques related to big data.
Right.
I don't know if thinking of big data as this multi-dimensional or multi-source phenomena might help you in terms of separating what is data collection from how we analyze the data that we collect.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I certainly think it helps me do conceptual work to sort of separate those out. Yeah, anyway, thank you. Yeah, I'll look further into that.
Other comments? Yeah, Barb? Oh, sorry.
No, you go ahead.
Sorry. Corner of my eye.
I find this fascinating, and I'm not quite sure where to start, but so how much do you think the issue is ignorance on the part of the customer? So I think if you note in the paper that we all sign these agreements, right? We have no idea what's in these agreements. And even if we did, I don't think we'd really have an idea of how this information would be used. So in some sense, part of the problem here is we're starting off with this is like a new environment that most of us are either totally inept in the ability to understand,
Right.
or we don't care, or a lot of people don't care. So to me, the bigger issue seems to be, I guess I'm less worried about the surplus generation, and I'm not quite sure what's meant by overharvesting in this particular case. But what I am concerned about is maybe this, which I think you call the negative externality, which is this ability to harvest data from individuals that they actually have no idea that this data is being generated and how it's being used. And to me, and I think you are separating these things, but at least when I'm reading this paper, this is what comes to my mind as the biggest issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so a few points. I think what I mean by the overharvesting is this exact idea, that when you think, oh yeah, sure Google, I'll share my location data with you, we don't really have a meaningful notion of what that means or what sorts of fine-grained predictions can be made when we share that information. So we think we're sharing sort of this boundary of knowledge about ourselves, when in fact, particularly when you combine that information with all the other information Google has about us, we're sharing this much. And so that's in fact what I kind of mean by the overharvesting.
So maybe in some sense, I think you allude to this in the beginning, but maybe a few examples in the beginning would help to, for those of us who are not into this literature, sort of help us to think about like how badly can this data be used. We all know the target story,
Yeah.
right? But beyond that, just how big a problem is it? And I suspect it is a big problem. Without really knowing this area, it would help to have a better understanding. So I think more and more of us do understand the environment, climate change problem, thank goodness.
Right.
But I think this is an area that I think you can start to see how it could be misused. But some good examples that would illustrate that I think would be helpful.
And sort of maybe pull those up to the wave front.
Yeah.
Because they're sort of littered throughout, but yeah.
Or maybe pounding them in our heads a little more.
Right.
This is the really bad thing that could happen. So,
Yeah.
a secondary interesting point in there that climate change has in fact done a good job, or climate change scientists, community, fill in the blank of how we embrace that sort of large ecosystem that had to convince us all that climate change is real. When all of us are pretty stupid when it comes to science, right? I make the joke that I understand how the rain happens, but that's, yeah, and I get that rain happens, and therefore if there are pollutants in the ground, it probably ends up in the rain. But most of us understand like 8th grade science, earth science. But somehow the scientists have communicated to us in a way that is accessible to everyone. And maybe that's a little less, one hopes, well, yeah.
Those who will listen.
As soon as I said it out loud, I'm going to stay out of that. But with that said, at least it's opened up a debate for people who are trying to understand and people who think the world is flat. How about we do it that way?
Can I just one?
But I wonder if part of that is something you can reflect upon as well, is how did the science community start getting people to not only care, but understand enough to care, because that's maybe some of what's missing at the beginning of the paper.
This is a good time for me to jump in. I'm Kevin. I'm with the Indiana Geological and Water Survey. I'm a cartographer turned data scientist. And so I'm a member of the Earth Science Information Partners. And so it's the Geological Survey. We're an organization that creates as well as manages and serves data. And so this is a topic that's been on my mind for a while, as I've watched what I call the data landscape evolve.
Right.
Your work has been the first that has really put into clear terminology thoughts that have been bouncing in my head. So thank you very much. And so the earth science community has sees these problems, but so I see it as a bit as the double-edged swords of big data.
Right.
The earth science community has been working on the positive and understanding the tools and capabilities of big data, while the secondary has been how is this impacting how we do science and how we share our data and those impacts. For us as an organization, we met with Angie, and then when we started exploring open data, what open publishing actually meant, and that opened our eyes to the people that are actually making the decisions are lawyers and policymakers with a very minimal understanding of how, not of science, but how the daily work of science is done. And so our state geologist, one of 48 because of funding, few have fell away, is concerned about one of his perspective of big data is for kind of the vacuum terminology of we're sucking in lots of data, and we'll use our filters and algorithms to clean up the noise. Whereas an organization like ourselves, our data is built upon the authority of it, and that's built upon the quality. And so many questions, and it's all in regards to the changed data landscape. It's how as an organization we react and change or not change in response to the data landscape, and then so many things. But so then if the data landscape is now being driven by these economic drivers and not scientific or government, how does that change access to data? For those of us, because we're supposed to collect our data for free or serve it for free, as a public service, well, the data landscape has changed to be economically. So there's many things. So I'm gonna put that out there and
I mean, I think you're highlighting something that I try to draw attention to, but I actually think I should maybe even make more stark, and that I did in earlier versions of this paper, which is, I think, get to a fundamental misalignment in this market, that a lot of the most pressing questions that we think big data analytic techniques would be well served to answer are not being met by this particular type of harvesting and enclosure of data collection by a handful of private companies. So we know a lot more about what kind of shoes I'm most likely to buy next Thursday than we do about the flow of rainfall across the United States, which seems like an important thing to understand and know in significant detail if you believe climate change is happening, which I think most people in this room do, right? So you're seeing incredibly analytic techniques that require a significant amount of data collection, but the promise of those techniques seem to be misaligned or maybe thwarted by the profit incentive at this point in this marketplace. And that profit incentive is feeding off of, sort of the legal structure, which right now says the only thing standing between them and all the information that could possibly be relevant to what shoes I want next Thursday is me clicking a terms of service.
And to follow is time, is the speed at which all of these changes have been implemented.
Right.
Also compared to the speed at which science and scientific funding is performed, and,
Right.
and changes to those structures, that's where there's more questions than answers when the scientific community, and really I've only heard my voice, and it's thanks to Angie's about, because when the question has come up, it's like, who is asking and thinking about these questions? I said, well, it's the lawyers, and they go, but that's where
you're in trouble.
But so one of my arguments is, and it came out of a slightly depressed walk back to my office one day. Okay, well, what do we do when
Right.
when copyright and all these other forces are at? And so one thing I take as a scientist is transparency in my work. And so so what I think is that by working together between the lawyers and everybody else, we can solve this together. But with the earth science community, it seems to be right now the best approach is transparency within methods, tracking of the metadata and provenance, where the data came from, where it went, who changed what,
Right.
And all of that jazz.
But I mean, the stark difference being that you are spending time, effort, and money and capacity on creating these mechanisms of accountability, whereas like I have no idea what sort of information Google has on me, how that information is being used, what sorts of predictions it's making about me, who they're selling those insights to on the back end. And that's a company that we actually have some amount of visible insight to. That's not even touching the data broker market. So, I think you're seeing sort of this double standard emerging, and it's especially onerous on the people who are answering more defensively questions in the public interest. And that, that's a significant misalignment, coupled with the fact that you're starting to see in social science research, maybe not quite to the same amount in the harder sciences or, sort of environmental sciences. Yeah, environmental sciences, the fact that now if you want to study the social world, you pretty much have to go to a handful of companies and ask them to get access to their data.
Yeah, and Amazon works out $200,000 for a small sample. That's more than our annual budget for the entire organization.
Yeah. And so what does it do to independent social inquiry in the social scientific research that you have to go to a handful of private entities to study the social world?
Yeah, and that's some of my things about how does all this trickle down 10 years from now.
Yeah, the second or third order effects that you create here.
The funding.
Totally.
Barb?
Yeah.
Yes, I really enjoyed reading this body of work in progress, and we've talked a little bit, and we'll follow it further, but also for maybe so the group catch what we've been talking about. This body of research journey has got complex systems theory written all over it. You're talking about the coevolution of technical, economic, and legal systems. And when you're describing a lot of the phenomena, we can describe that as emergent properties. You're talking about the emergent properties that come from this coevolution and how the legal regime, as it started and as it's evolving, is actually locking in a feedback loop. What I noticed throughout here, and I share with my notes if you find it helpful, what I find that you're explaining here is analogous to what some people have written about the coevolution of the technology, economics, and the law in the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution. And this has to do with understanding that some of the key technologies were network technologies.
Right.
So when you talk about railroads, telephone and telegraph, a lot of the effects that you're talking about is just happening all over again. And a key development in transportation, as you can point out, datafication, well, in transportation, the physical transportation was containerization.
Right.
Okay? And so some of the phenomena that you're explaining is just another manifestation of how these systems continue to co-evolve. What I also found really fascinating is this is a case where we need very interdisciplinary analysis, where we need the social science, the science, but we also need the law, because you have to understand how the law evolves. And what really caught my eye is understanding that the origins of a lot of these bodies of law are in tort. The United States being an English common law jurisdiction, early bodies of law evolved through the common law system, which is itself a complex system. And during the 19th century, when common law evolution was too slow, we had an institutional shift towards progressively more statutorification, relying more on statutes. And then what happens is, during the 19th century, with the rise of statutorification, we also had, because of the Industrial Revolution, the rise of the corporate form, which started shifting a lot of the power away from the individual, another phenomenon you point out here, the juxtaposition of the corporations providing these technologies and the power they have over the individual. And the body and law, contract law under common law, tried to evolve to deal with some of that, recognizing contracts have adhesion and so on and so forth.
Right.
But the companies have been successful through statutorification and interpretation by this Supreme Court to get a radical reinterpretation to essentially preempt the states from being able to enforce consumer protection and contract common law to deal with this imbalance in bargaining power. A lot of this stuff that you're describing is fascinating. What you're describing in the privacy data area is just another manifestation of what we've already seen in some others. But because information technology itself is converging, or communications types, what you really have to do is integrate what's happening now with that, with what already had happened with telephone and telegraph and the bodies of law as those started to evolve. And that's where I find particularly exciting, because that's what my research was about, was watching the shift in how these bodies of law work. So complex systems perspective is another way of constructing how to analytically look at it in a way so that people from different disciplines can understand this is a systems analysis. And then people can understand how each of their own disciplines contributes to understanding the coevolution of these systems. And then one other thing I'll just point out, and then I know we might get down to people, we can talk further about this, but when you get to part 3, where it's your continuing work on progress of it, how do we deal with solutions?
Yeah.
One thing I want to highlight, when you get on your last page and you're talking about antitrust market power approaches, antitrust public utility approaches, things like that, this is where, from a systems perspective, it's really important to recognize you're referring to older bodies of law for which, when they develop, the temporal sequencing of them is very important, because they evolve to deal with certain specific problems. And even as they've continued to evolve in their interpretation, some of them have started to stray from what their original purpose was. So even when you say antitrust market power, are you talking about going back to what they originally meant and recovering the original meaning, or how some of them have actually been, I would argue, misapplied in part due to corporate power?
Yeah.
And the influence in the policy-making process, the statutorification process, and in how cases get argued with the courts. So the temporal sequencing of these bodies of law are important for understanding what they were intended to address, recovering that original meaning, and then being clear about what you mean about that. And we talked a little bit separately about that. Public utility law is an area that's totally misunderstood today from what it really meant. It's a common, most people don't realize public utility law came from the common law. It evolved under the common law and arises from government giving a franchise to an entity. That's all it really was. A franchise granted to an entity. It may or may not be monopoly, it didn't have to be, and to which certain powers are granted from the government, like eminent domain. Things like that. And we've lost sight of what it really means to be a public utility. And some of the colloquial usage of some of these terms, or by non-lawyers, and now even misunderstood by some lawyers today. We've got to be careful about our terminology, because we can't even be clear when we're talking about the same thing or not.
Right.
So this is one of the challenges that you're going to find working with this, is really wrestling down, even when you're referring to certain bodies of law, as of what point in time, as of what function, as its original function, as its, how is it strayed maybe from that? Are you saying jumping from the way it functions today, or are you talking about recovering its earlier meaning? All this stuff gets really tricky.
Right.
Anyway, I'm really excited that you're doing this. I see a lot of parallels to stuff that I've been working on, which I shared with you. So I can really get my juices flowing on this.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to offer a few comments about how it looks from the perspective of somebody who studied something that I think is a lot of similarity.
Totally. Quick point on the public utility and the antitrust stuff. There's actually really, really interesting work being done right now to try to revive some of the original purpose of those laws. So the reference to antitrust, I'm actually specifically, it's not maybe not in the outline, but I'm specifically interested in drawing out and explicitly highlighting the Lena Khan's approach to Amazon, which is all about sort of early days doing conceptual work to reinvigorate some of the original approaches of antitrust to explicitly deal with market power, when the past 30 to 40 years of jurisprudence has largely been an over-focus on price theory and consumer harm. And so
it's straight from its original intent.
Totally. And you know, I'm
Antitrust
sort
was
of
a result
relying
of a
on-
corporate power problem in the 19th century. Totally.
Of course, the curse of bigness, Louis Brandeis.
And it was really understanding, though, the difference between people acting through collective entities that have been given legal status and rights compared to an individual.
Right.
And
so
it's created some systemic problems that are unique.
And so I mean, so there's work in the data space that explicitly addresses that issue and sort of the reinvigorating
That's really helpful
original
to recover
law.
that.
Yeah, and Sabeel Rahman's work on public utility approaches to technology platforms is also very much interested in sort of reviving original purposes of public utility. So I'm sort of drawing from their work in that footnote that is sort of doing conceptual work in that space. Yeah. Other?
Yes, sir.
I'm Z. I'm a doctoral student at School of Public Health, and also I'm a data science student at the School of Informatics. So I have a couple of questions, I mean 2 or 3 questions.
Sure.
I really enjoy reading your draft. So the first one is, do you have, I mean, you first in the introduction part categorize those high-tech companies into 2 categories. I just wonder, do you have an example that regarding the negative externality regarding the company who technically not, I mean, provide service not free, for example, Uber or Lyft or Amazon, well, not Amazon, or Netflix, their like negative impact while they collect.
Yeah, so I think the negative externalities can take a number of forms. So one is that currently, if any of those companies experience a data breach, the actual difficulty and cost of dealing with your data being breached and having to change your social security number, change your password, like go on Have I Been Pwned and figure out which one of your emails you can't use anymore, set up your forwarding for all of that. Like those costs are externalized regardless of how that data is being used by a company onto the consumer. And so that's a shifting of an externality cost onto a consumer as opposed to the producer. As opposed to the larger structural and societal forces, the fact that information about me collected by someone like Hulu can later be sold to a data broker, collated with a bunch of other information, sold to a health insurance company that causes his health insurance to go up. Because now they know that I have a pre-existing conditions and the likelihood of my brother having the same pre-existing condition applies outside of just me and outside of just my transaction with Hulu. So that's kind of one of many examples.
Sure, thank you. Another question I have actually is, so you mentioned that lots of traditional non-tech companies are right now like even through merger or acquisition to get the power of big data.
Right.
So, and I know lots of consulting or professional services companies actually provide those services to those companies. Do you think, is there kind of necessary to regulate those professional companies to, when they provide those professional services, for example, BCG Gamma provided the big data analytics for lots of companies. Do you think, is there necessary for them to, for us to, for the government to regulate their professional services practice?
That's a really good question. So, I mean, definitely in this paper, and the part 3 sort of approaches that I put forward are very much interested in regulating at the point of collection, because that's sort of what I see as the central, to your point about sort of disambiguating some of what we're clustering as big data analytics, is that I think the point of nexus with an individual is when the information about me is being collected. So to the extent that BCG has particular analytical mechanisms or tools that are being deployed on data sets, I don't know if it fits as neatly into the regulatory proposal that I'm putting forward, but I mean, they certainly are a live aspect and sort of actors in this marketplace, and I would be interested in hearing what the room has to say about people sort of doing the extraction or collection, which is what I focus on, versus the people sort of deploying the analytical techniques that are intimately related, but I think somewhat separate, at least conceptually, in this paper.
Because I agree. Their practice actually be a role as a teacher to teach those companies practice.
Right. And they're sort of bringing a set of analytical tools that are clearly related, but are sort of directly involved in the collection of data itself. Yeah.
But doesn't this take us back to Ricardo's comment?
I
was just seeing this.
Yes, sorry.
Your definition of big data shows a number of functionalities.
Yeah.
The regulation may need to be multifaceted to address the different functionalities.
Completely.
Point of collection is just one point.
Yeah.
Right.
How it's used, there may be multiple ways to deal with each of the different functionalities that collectively are giving the negative externalities that you're talking about.
Totally.
Kind of a parallel in the science community has been who is responsible for the data.
Mm-hmm.
So I make it, I share it, you download it as open data, you tweak it, add to it, clean it, do something, share it again, someone else is the original author of that data responsible, is the middle person, and those are some ambiguity, using the data in the landscape that folks are having trouble working out.
Right.
I see kind of the similars within this argument.
Right, and there are sort of legal approaches or analogies that I sort of draw from in part 3 are interesting or worth highlighting, and one being sort of in the 19th century Industrial Revolution era tort law coming up with this idea of product liability. So you no longer have you just go to your tailor, your tailor made your shoe from beginning to end, and if your shoe falls apart, you know who to go sue because you have what we call privity of contract with the tailor. Now you have 10,000 people working on one tiny part of the shoe that you end up purchasing, and somewhere something goes wrong. And how do we assign liability in that kind of complex manufacturing chain? And so that's sort of a useful analog that I try to bring in and highlight for a complex and interrelated system where there's maybe no one person who put together this complete package that's causing.
Because I think authorship and credit for data and things is in some ways how the scientific community is addressing this in parallel.
Right.
And we're working it out.
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
So my name is Marcella, I'm a visiting scholar, and I wonder, because every time when I read stuff related to what you were writing, I feel like trapped. Because something that I will not be able to go out. So, and I wonder how much, if or how much it matters, the consumer perspective of freedom of not giving your data, and second, the exit option. Like, there's the classic case, Facebook. I want to delete my data, but in fact, you will never. Your data will still be there.
Exactly. Yeah, and so I sort of highlight that in the part 2, that there really is no meaningful exit option here. I mean, even if you were to exit your day-to-day lived encounters, they still have all of the information about you, and I think as Zeynep Tufekci does a good job of sort of bringing out into the public, they have shadow profiles of non-Facebook users, right? Yeah, I mean, I think what I tried to get at a little bit in the like reasonable consumer sort of idea is that if it exists, if there's a set of values that are being generated that exist outside of your expected interaction and transaction with Facebook, and harm occurs because of that, the liability for that harm exists with Facebook.
But the first part of
Right.
I don't want to give my location to Google.
Right.
And okay, they say you will not, but if you will not give your location, you will not access, I don't know what type of data you need. So it is a kind of nested trade.
Right.
I give you the access, but in exchange you give me your data.
I like that.
So this follows up. So Lee did. There are people watching.
Great.
He wanted to know if there is what if we give people more choice? What if free equals we collect all your private data? You pay $25, we collect a little bit less. You know, you pay $10, and we collect. You know, sort of that prorated ladder type. And he wondered, is this even feasible? And I think the answer is yes, it's feasible. But in a regulatory context, comment on the difficulties created with that.
Yeah. I mean,
I don't want to answer it.
you
No, I want you to answer it, and then.
so this gets
But
to
it goes right to the heart of what she's talking about, right?
Right.
Failure to pony up my information means now I can't have a decent Google map. So
Right.
it's sort of like keep
Yes.
driving, good luck.
Yeah.
What if you charged me $10 and I was okay with you collecting my data just for the trip?
Right. And so you start to see people sort of creating this like limited notion of sort of use-based restrictions. So I'm okay with you collecting information about me to make this map better, but I'm not okay with you using the information about me that you were saying is to make this map better to in fact create a more rich profile to target advertising about. And if that means that I pay $1 to use the map, then maybe I'm willing to do that. I think there's promise in those sorts of things. I think they depend on a legal regulatory backbone that demands that companies offer you services, or not demands, but sort of structures and creates an expectation that they offer you a service for the thing that you're transacting for that's not premised on you turning over all of your data with no nuance and sort of not being able to turn the tap off. And you already see that happening. So the GDPR kind of does that, and California's data protection regulation that's live right now sort of gives that sort of consumer right. And those enhanced rights live, I think, conceptually in a sort of enhanced consumer protection framework, where we just say, you can't premise access to this service on someone turning over all of their information for all of time unambiguated. You can create tiers, or you can sort of decide to pull back your data at some point, but there needs to be that type of choice or option on the table as sort of a backstop.
I happen to know you're big on this, so comment on what happens to the disenfranchised when my data, because I can't afford $10, is now the only stuff that's getting connected. Because I know you're big on this.
Right,
so.
right. Yeah, so I mean, I think a risk and sort of a debate or a conversation we need to have when we're thinking about governance or regulatory regimes are what are the second order effects that we create by allowing or encouraging that sort of tiered access paywall. And I tend to kind of think about it as like the airport, right? Like if you are rich and fancy and you can afford to stay in the like private lounge, then you don't have to deal with being in this like loud, public, hectic space where you have sort of all the announcements and people running around and people eating around you and all of that stuff. And so sort of thinking about, as a first principle, do we think that privacy is a right, or do we think that privacy is a privilege? And how do we sort of structure our governance approaches accordingly? So, we can create sort of tiered access payment things, but functionally what will that do? That will mean that privacy is a privilege. You can pay for it, but if you can't pay for it, too bad. You're seeing like 1 million advertisements and you're being fed into all the micro-targeting, and by the way, that also means that you're probably disproportionately knowing a whole lot about information about communities that have traditionally already been over-surveilled by the state.
This is where another policy option comes into play. You have to, but by looking at other technologies. If you're talking about the disenfranchised having access, maybe this would lead to the evolution of another form of universal service policy.
Mm-hmm.
What type of minimum access, if we're going to have use restricted collection of data, what minimum types of packages or tiers must be available, at least to the
Right.
people who can otherwise afford it. And that's
Everyone
another,
gets this level for free.
yeah, and this is historically what happens with network
Right.
technologies.
Mm-hmm.
In the U.S., universal service policy started with the postal system,
Right.
and then was expanded to the telephone and stuff like that, and broadband now. So it just struck me the way you're phrasing it here. Another thing is looking at another aspect of universal service, and particularly since people's access. This is where you get into you could expand upon the universal service programs you already have for broadband and things like that to now maybe include some of the platforms, stuff like that. So I'm sorry, I just had to throw that out. It just came in my head.
No, that's helpful.
My name is Claudia. I am comparativist, so I always have to ask this question. So what kind of legal examples do we have from other countries in addressing these issues?
Mm-hmm. Well, the immediate example that comes to mind, of course, is Europe with the General Data Protection Regulation. It's not as cleanly just a pure consumer protection framework. They have some different fundamental rights in Europe that sort of structure their approach very differently. But what I do like about the GDPR is that it doesn't fall into what I sort of see as the trap of just assigning a property right in data. So it does sort of deal fundamentally with a consent-based regime where we're not treating information about me as a thing that I now can just transact with companies for, but it's still fundamentally structured under an idea of a relationship that we need to sort of create appropriate governance boundaries around. So I definitely draw a little bit from the GDPR approach, not as explicitly in this paper, but in some other work. I think Japan is starting to look at some really interesting models in this space. It's very much live and evolving, and I'm looking forward to finding out more about it. India, interestingly, has just passed some really interesting legislation in this space that seems to be a kind of backdoor for increased state control. So what they call the data protection regulation, in fact, creates really broad exceptions or sort of excuses for state intervention. And so, always trade-offs are sort of interesting things to watch in this area, particularly when you're talking about sort of subject-centered control and wanting to appropriately use the state as a way to not allow individuals to be overly coerced, but then creating opportunities or space for state regimes to sort of step in and sort of create backdoors into a lot of these companies.
And what about China, that they have so much control?
Yeah, so the running joke is that in the US, data is the company's. In Europe, the data is yours. And in China, the data is the state's. So all of that is kind of de facto and not de jure, but yeah, I mean, it's interesting.
They're also investing heavily in the technology and advancement of the science.
Right.
So,
yeah.
As we are looking at the world in the coming years for examples, that I hope that they come up with some different strategies and the rest of us don't follow too closely.
Right. But I mean, that's another really good example to your question about the potential negative externalities. I mean, once information about you is out there, you kind of have to operate under the assumption that information about you is out there forever. And so if you have regimes that want to get access to that information, maybe by force, from that it's all being held by a private company that they can easily access and use to further state control, that is a very real, live, kind of permanent potential negative externality from mass data collection. And we have very strong, powerful, historical examples of that to draw on. Anyway.
Yeah, so when I was reading this, I found it very interesting, but I was wondering how big of a problem this is to get out of, because you kind of allude to it, like with the start, this market power problem, which I'm convinced by, but you kind of allude to it as almost as if it's like a market failure. This doesn't seem like a market failure to me. this seems like a political competition story, and therefore it's rent seeking.
Right.
And so
That's
it's,
really
it's,
interesting.
it's capture theory, right?
Right.
Stigler, would say, look, these firms had every interest in getting together and making the rules in their favor.
Right.
Right, and so it's really a rent-seeking story with a special interest because we have these problems of information. It's not they're leveraging the lack of information in the market. They're leveraging the rules.
Right.
They're going in and they're lobbying and creating the rules. And so I don't know. Maybe I guess how much of that is true, and then how useful then is the way you're kind of motivating the paper at the beginning. Because I'm seeing this much more as like a Stiglerian capture story.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think the point of view from which the paper is written is very much like how does a consumer walk around and sort of experience and exert choice or express preferences in this kind of market. And from the consumer perspective, it feels like there really isn't space to operate, and that's kind of the failure that I'm trying to write from and motivate. But I completely agree with you that another very real part of this story, I mean, why we're in contract land to begin with has a lot to do with capture theory.
And it's an Olson problem. I mean, we as the consumers are the big group. The problems disperse through us.
Right.
And so how are we
Classic
supposed
collective
to,
action issue.
They don't have a collective action problem, and we do.
Right. And I think that's completely true. I mean, what's motivating sort of the part 2 perspective is almost a move or a response to the counter narrative, which is, but if we were to exert some sort of collective action or create a legal protection of collective action, that would be state interference in this interpersonal sort of private transaction. But it's a private transaction structured completely by laws written by the people looking to extract rent.
I mean, are there people? Because are there really people out there saying, let's leave it to the market?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Okay. Yeah,
So this is the new
it's
techie
the
theory,
bootleggers
right?
and Baptists. Then they're providing some kind of a moral public justification for this.
Right.
Meanwhile, the bootleggers are really the ones guiding the story.
Right, exactly. I mean, when you try to regulate in this space, you hear you will kill innovation, and privacy is dead anyway. No one cares. So, yeah.
Which I think is, but it also adds to the fact that now we have social structures in place and networked communities that operate in the ability, Facebook isn't just now the lobbyists, they're also the news.
Yes.
They're everything. So they're not.
They're all, yeah.
So they're everything. I mean, it eliminates some of the old categories, right? Where you used to have to convince, mainstream media, communications, blah, 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 to buy into your narrative. Now we are. We just are. We jiggle your news feed. We create the news ourselves. We go to the wrong places. I mean, it's sort of sorry, I walk around saying we're doomed.
Yeah.
A lot. But it does push new boundaries in new areas.
Totally.
I mean, those are some of the concerns that us as authoritative data creators are concerned about within this new landscape.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
Other questions? We have a couple minutes.
5 more minutes. So.
But
I think this is related to externalities, but most of this is from user permission, kind of users inputting data. Does the law at this point address or recognize the difference? I'm thinking about our advances in AI and machine learning and image recognition and the data that can be collected about people that's not given. I think it's just, maybe it's that second level of big data. I think it's more maybe to the analytics of you're generating data about people from secondary data sources. So like Google's cars, that are driving around and scanning every street, well, they're also collecting the demographic and all of that, and you tie that to the GPS, blah, 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 but
right.
We're also, in the future, cars, every car, modern cars have the LiDAR system and extra camera sensors, so that's so the Internet of Things is a whole nother sort of this, I guess, is there a difference from the legal perspective between user data and these data about users? I guess, is that where it comes in, this harvesting?
Yeah. I mean, I wish we were even at that level, but
Yeah.
no. No. I mean, that is, I would love to be able to get to a point where we're like, okay, we've meaningfully fixed and solved liability for data about me personally. Now we can start to think about, a picture of me I was sensed by an autonomous vehicle crossing the street. Like, what rights do I have about that information? We're not even there yet.
Yeah.
No.
It does get to I think an interesting point where I think it's worth resisting the temptation to answer this with an individual property right, because information isn't really ever just about one person, and it doesn't neatly track that type of sort of solution, right? So I think it's something worth keeping in mind when we're thinking about what our regulatory responses are, but like we are not even there yet.
Yeah, information's like light, it's like a particle and a wave.
It's a particle and a wave. I actually had that exact thought a couple of days ago. I'm like, when I'm talking about technologists or like lawyers, like who's that?
I was going to
useful for?
suggest too, this might be where you want to bring out, I remember one reference in your paper about these intellectual property laws, copyright, patent, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
This is also related to what rights property these companies have for when they develop software or systems to manipulate data. Okay, and this is where there is a significant difference between the issues you're talking about and what happened in the 19th century, because the network infrastructures that we're talking about, like with railroads, telephone, and telegraph, they were all common carriers. They didn't produce the content of what they transmitted. And so
they weren't
the
being
law,
live, updated, perfected, and
well,
improved
but
by
the law,
information.
and therefore they don't have, for example, First Amendment rights as common carriers in their conduit function. One of the things that's different is that when you have these technologies that involve different ways of content creation, and see, this is a big battle with net neutrality too, is whether these entities, ISPs, internet service providers, are common carriers or not, or as to which functions.
Right.
They try and claim that they're not common carriers, that they have a form of speaker role for purposes of First Amendment protection
Right.
in the United States to protect them from regulation. So this is where I think an important part might be in further fleshing out what you're talking about with this datafication and data imperative, the way in which the laws are actually giving certain rights to those that are using techniques and technology to develop the data, and therefore what is the scope of permissible government regulation? We, in the U.S. in particular, with for example, the First Amendment and things like that, those are laws that are rubbing up against each other too.
Right. There's really interesting directions of First Amendment jurisprudence right now that are referring to it as new Lochnerism. That
Yes.
First Amendment essentially serving as like a hard stop against economic
It's
regulation.
being weapon, or some people are referring to as a form of weaponization of the First Amendment.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Well, we are out of time, and we try really hard to stay on time because we appreciate you giving us your lunch hour. So, wonderful paper and a wonderful discussion. Thank you.
You good?
Good conversation.
Yes, and the weather is really nice.
Yeah. I'm gonna try to grab the guy I did.
Oh, wait.
Yeah.
Sí.
Va a estar interesante